Hello everyone, welcome to another patron voted Shmup review. Shout outs to the patrons for supporting the channel, I really do appreciate it. And to show how much I appreciate it, I am getting this review done, even though I have a wicked sore throat, so if I sound like crap, I do apologize. But the show must go on. And so today I am talking about Mars Matrix. Yes, it is more than just a meme. For those who are familiar with some shmupping lore and that type of thing, there's a video that came out a long time ago that was like review of Cave or something like that. I'll put the thumbnail up here. But anyway, as he's going, it's like a meme review, and as he's going through and reviewing these Cave games, he keeps cutting and saying, go play Mars Matrix, go play Mars Matrix. So Mars Matrix has a bit of a meme status within the world of shmups, which I'm not entirely sure why. Probably because of how wild and unconventional some of its game design choices are, but nonetheless, it is actually a very good game. A lot of fun to play, a lot of fun to score, incredibly deep for what you're expecting. So in this review, I'll be going over not only my thoughts on Mars Matrix as a game, but also my thoughts on how you might want to approach playing this game as far as a accessibility type of thing, because there's basically three different options, and I'll start with that. So the first way, of course, is to play it on the Sega Dreamcast. Unfortunately, my Sega Dreamcast, while I can play it on my Sega Dreamcast, I cannot actually record footage from it because it turns out the OSSC does not like VGA output, and I have a VGA cable set up for my Dreamcast. So while I can play it in a good resolution on my monitor and all that stuff, I can't capture it because the OSSC doesn't like that. So until I get an RGB cable for it, unfortunately my Sega Dreamcast cannot output what I need to output. But I did play it on the Dreamcast. And then when you go to playing it on PC or on, some other platform, right? There are basically two other options. You can go with the MAME branch, like Groovy MAME. I don't think Shmup MAME can run it, to be honest, but Groovy MAME and regular MAME. Or you can run it on a good old Shmup Arch. And so, in my opinion, I think this one's a pretty open and shut case in that you're going to want to run it on RetroArch or Shmup Arch. And you're probably going to have to set the settings, so I actually haven't configured this before. So the next update of Shmup Arch, I'll have a Mars Matrix configuration. But the reason why I point this out is because some games, when you emulate them on the PC, like Mars Matrix, they tend to emulate very laggy in MAME. And Mars Matrix is one such of these games. So it's probably going to be around 4 to 5 frames in MAME, which is just a lot, to be honest. Where you put the good old run ahead on in RetroArch, you get that run ahead set to 3. I'll show on the screen there. You set it to 3, and then you're working around 1 to 2 frames of input lag, and it feels buttery smooth. It feels much better. So I recommend playing it on RetroArch, Shmup Arch. One other little note is, for the life of me, I could not get this bad boy to boot in MAME. I tried the best I could, but MAME was just rejecting every ROM I threw at it. So at one point I gave up. I'm like, okay, forget this. So I think those are your two options of playing it, and I was curious to see how it responds on the Sega Dreamcast, because the thing about the Dreamcast is that for some reason the Capcom ports onto the Dreamcast are pretty laggy. Street Fighter 3 Third Strike is notorious for this. It has 6 frames of input lag, and that's why it's not used competitively in stuff like Cooperation Cup and all that sort of thing. It's just too laggy, and they play on PCB anyway, but yeah, Third Strike players are all aware, don't play Third Strike on the Dreamcast because it's way too laggy. Recently, people have been a little bit surprised to find that Gunbird 2 on the Sega Dreamcast is also pretty dang laggy. I can't remember the exact numbers that Shmup Junkie came up with, but what I ended up doing is I ended up launching Dreamcast in a emulator on a RetroArch, like the Flycast emulator, just because it has a really convenient feature called Frame Advance, where you can go through and kind of test to see how the lag shakes out. The thing about it is I'm not entirely sure how this measures to console, but I can compare games to one another, at least, right? And this is incredibly accurate because you can literally count the frames as you play. It's as accurate as you're going to get. So I tested 3 different games and kind of compared them. So first was Gunbird 2, because that one's known for being laggy on the original hardware. That one came out to 5 frames when I did the Frame Advance in the emulator, and that didn't really surprise me. That's kind of in the same ballpark, it sounds like. And then I went ahead and I did Ikaruga, right? The classic Ikaruga, because Ikaruga tends to run well on everything. It just has this charm to it. I guess the Treasure team are really good about this. Everything I played on, it seems to run well and have low latency. And the Dreamcast port is no different. So Ikaruga on the Dreamcast has 3 frames of input lag in the emulator. So this could be less, this could be more on original hardware, I'm not entirely sure. But we can say for sure that it has 2 less frames of input lag than Gunbur 2, which is a pretty big deal, to be honest. And then lastly, I did Mars Matrix because I was like, okay, this is a Capcom release. What's it sitting at? No surprise, it is fairly laggy. So it isn't as bad as Gunbur 2, but it's almost as bad. So Gunbur 2's 5 frames. It's just, that's what you're going to get. With Mars Matrix, I was getting basically 4 frames half the time and 5 frames the other half. So I'd rate it a 4.5 input lag. Not the end of the world. Obviously, if you're playing something on the Dreamcast, I was hoping to see better input lag. But at the same time, I was not surprised because it seems like these Capcom Dreamcast ports across the board just seem to struggle with some sort of input lag issue with the way they ported it or whatever it is. Ikaruga, on the other hand, responds in 3 frames. Again, this is in the emulator, so it could be less on original hardware, but it just shows that optimization of your port is really important when it comes to input lag. So that is a little bit of a bummer if you're playing it on the Dreamcast. But again, the silver lining is if you want to play Mars Matrix with less input lag, good old Shmup Arch is there for you. You can crank that down to 3 and you'll be ready to roll. So that's just some thoughts on the technical aspects of the game. Now let's talk about the game itself and also differences between playing it on arcade or playing it on the Dreamcast. So overall, I'll go over my thoughts on the Dreamcast port first. I think overall, despite the input lag stuff, the Dreamcast port of Mars Matrix is very impressive because of the amount of stuff they put in there. I didn't explore the range mode all that much, but it's still really cool that it's there. And you know, there actually isn't all that much gameplay footage of it or people talking about it too much. It seems pretty much overlooked. So if you want to get into Mars Matrix in your own unique way, play the arrange mode because it doesn't seem to be all that popular. But it is there. That's really cool. Also, the port has some stage select. It has the arcade mode, and apparently the big draw of playing it in the arcade mode on the Dreamcast is that it removes the counter stop. So I believe the arcade version has a little bit of a too easy counter stop, at least from what I've heard. So if you want to, I guess if you want to play it for scored, the Dreamcast version is the way to go because it removes the counter stop. So that's a huge benefit for the Dreamcast port. I don't think there's quite the same workaround as Futari when it comes to playing it on arcade or whatever. But if you're not going for counter stops and that type of thing, I think playing it on arcade is the better way to go because of the better lag and also just all the nice features that come along with RetroArch, like save states and all that good stuff. But overall, I do think the port is very solid, and if you want to play it on the original hardware, I don't think you can go wrong there. It's going to be a little laggy, but some people are more or less sensitive to that. So let's talk about the game itself. So Mars Matrix is an interesting one because it is made by Takumi, the same developer that made Gigawing, and so it has a lot of those same sort of underlying mechanics and ideas like Gigawing, where you have a shield mechanic basically, and the screen's full of bullets, and a lot of how the game works isn't your typical like cave style, oh let's weave around the bullets, let's move the bullets to the side and all that sort of stuff, which I mean, it does come up in Mars Matrix, but a lot of the time the way the routing works, it's almost kind of like Ikaruga in a way, speaking of Ikaruga, where a lot of the routing comes down to abusing that shield mechanic and learning how to set it up, where to set it up. And in this case, it's not necessarily a shield, it's like this gravity absorption thing that's pretty cool. Surprisingly, Mars Matrix is as complicated as the game as it is. It actually is just a one-button game. I was talking to some people on Discord about this, like Plasmo and Charlene, and they seem to like the idea that it was a one-button game. The cool thing about the Dreamcast is you can actually separate out the 3 different actions of that one button to different inputs. So the way it works is that in Mars Matrix you have 3 different things you can do with your one button. The first is you can just shoot your shot and you can auto fire or like rapid shot by, you know, mashing. Or if you time it, kind of like Bat Rider style, it like charges a little bit, and if you time it, it releases like this shock wave, and that it's really powerful. A piercing shot is what it's called. So if you time it, you release a piercing shot. And then if you hold it down and keep holding it down, then you activate this gravity barrier shield thing where it absorbs bullets in, and depending on the angle that you absorb them and the angle that you're moving, you can like throw them out. Or if you keep holding them, you turn them into a bomb and blow up and clear the screen. But then your meter has to recharge. And it all comes down to managing that recharge meter when it comes to routing the game, where ideally, especially in the heavier sections, what you want to do is you want to use like very tactical absorbs and releases, do too many of those full charge bombs and that sort of thing, because otherwise you're not going to get your shield back in time. However, if you're playing for strictly survival, you can get away with the full shielding and bombing a lot. So it is really interesting the differences that come up if you're trying to play for score or survival. I was watching some scoring replays, and it is really cool to see how strategic the game is. It has a sort of chaining element like in Donpachi, where you turn the bullets into these gold cubes and you want to chain together the cubes, and then you time the absorptions and the cancels. It reminds me a bit of like a chaining game, but in its own unique way. Rather than killing the enemies and having a meter there, your meter is in your reflect and in your collections, and it's actually really cool. So Mars Matrix is a game that I think is really interesting to both play for survival and for score, and the super plays of people playing it and getting high scores are really interesting to watch. On a difficulty side of things, I think Mars Matrix is a fairly difficult game. I think the thing about it that makes it tricky to quite gauge is a lot of its difficulty does come down to understanding and abusing that shield mechanic and also the other mechanics like the piercing shot and stuff. But for me in my playthrough, I mean, I went through, this isn't a true 1cc where I sat down and 1cc'd it. I played through with save states and kind of went stage by stage basically. I did no miss all the bosses though, I think, except the last boss, but I did make a save state and no miss the boss fights. And some of those boss fights are actually incredibly fun and difficult. And it's pretty interesting because the way you route the fights is a little bit unique because of the way you can use the shield mechanic, where basically a lot of it comes down to deciding, okay, which pattern is more wicked? Should I shield this pattern? Should I try and dodge this pattern? Because if you're not all that familiar with this absorption mechanic and you try to just straight up dodge all the attacks in the game is actually very difficult if you try to do that. I would love to see a challenge run of someone trying to clear Mars Matrix without ever using that shield. I don't even know if it's possible. Probably is, but that would be a really interesting way to play the game. Other than that, another thing that you have to comment on that's very unique about this game is its aspect ratio. So it is basically in some kind of strange 4:3 aspect ratio, but you're moving vertically. It's a vertical, I think is what people call it, where you're moving vertically, but the aspect ratio is actually pretty damn wide. I almost wonder if it's a little bit wider than a 4:3. I can't quite tell, but I think if you do the screen stretch in the options, you can get it into 4:3 basically. But the way it feels is that the game emphasizes the side-to-side movement much more than up and down movement. So in something like a cave game or traditional sort of vertical shmup, not only is side to side's important, but actually up and down is also incredibly important, because you're moving up the screen to be aggressive and point blank, like in Ketsui or something like that. You're moving down the screen to be defensive, and you're doing a lot of back and forth and that sort of thing and routing that way. In Mars Matrix, because it's this wider aspect ratio, you're concentrating much more on going left to right, and there's a lot of screen real estate. And it kind of feels like it's almost like 3 layers of field you have to cover. In this, you got to cover the left, the center, and the right, and they're like 3 distinct quadrants. It's pretty interesting. I think the game does a good job of making it not feel too stretched out, though. I did a funny little thing I'll show it here where I corrected the aspect ratio, and it's actually pretty humorous to see what happens to like the bullets and the movement, where I made it a traditional like vertical aspect ratio. I'd love to see someone do a clear doing that. It's kind of strange because your left to right movement feels pretty normal, but then when you go up to down, because it's all squished in, you're actually moving slower. It's interesting. Other things about Mars Matrix that I really enjoyed a lot is the visuals. So I've heard some kind of divided opinions on the visuals. I know Jamers isn't much of a fan. They kind of work for me, to be honest. It kind of adds to the charm of the game. It has this, I don't know what, saturated sort of cartoony but also a little bit anime feel to it. It feels a little bit meme, like it like kind of adds into the meme qualities of the game or the visuals, where it's hard to take it 100% serious because of the way the visuals look. But it's like somewhere between cute and gritty. It's somewhere in between the two. I was surprised it ran on the RetroArch Final Burn Neo core, because I was assuming because it has these 3D visuals it would be outside compatibility, but no, you can run it on older stuff. So I don't think it's all that hardware demanding on the emulation side of things. Unlike something like you're trying to run a Futari or something like that, where you need some real horsepower to make that happen. So I guess the last thing to discuss in this review is the game feel for people who have particular tastes of what type of shmup they're looking for. Mars Matrix is a Takumi shmup, so I think they have their own little subgenre, but since there's not that many and people probably haven't played all that much Gigawing and stuff, I'd probably compare it somewhere in between a Psycho game and a cave game. I think that's kind of a good middle ground to sort of describe it, where there are some bullet hell elements that if you're a cave player, you're going to be a little bit more familiar with. But also the bullet speeds are surprisingly fast, especially in the boss fights. And so there's a little bit of a Psycho element there as well with the bullet speeds. But then there's that X factor of the Kuminess with the shield mechanic that is very unique to this game and stuff like Gigawing, where you're not going to quite find something quite like it. And so if you're a big fan of Mars Matrix, you're a big fan of this game. It's kind of one of those types of titles. It's like an Ikaruga type of thing, actually, where if you're a big fan of Ikaruga, you're not going to quite find that same experience anywhere else. I think that's a good way to describe Mars Matrix. And on that note, if you like Ikaruga, you will probably like Mars Matrix. So maybe that's another way to put it. If you want something with a little bit of a more unique mechanic, a mechanic that defines the gameplay and you can kind of base your gameplay around, Mars Matrix has you covered there. So yeah, I do recommend the game. I'm looking forward to playing it some more in the future, going for a real 1cc and that sort of thing. I think one of these days I'm going to have to go on like a Dreamcast shmup kick where I just go through and blast through Ikaruga, blast through Mars Matrix, take out a Gigawing, all that sort of stuff. I mean, I got my Dreamcast waiting here. It's pretty neglected. So anyway, now I'd like to end this by thanking my patrons. So thank you to Adam Pearson, Adrian Reyes, Dingo, Andy Cap, Anthony A, Ben Wynn, Borgie22, Brian Shiver, Corio, Disco Stas, Leia, Dominic NG, Eric H, Full Set, Retro Schmupper, How Sue, Ilya, Kiwi, JLab, JB RPG, Joe Angelo, Gameboy Guru, K, Malays, Mark Toms, Maz, Meher Kalendrin, Queen Charlene, Nathaniel Davis, and Electron, 9, Okla Kugels, Philip Mason, Ram Q, Raul, Sketchy Raccoon, Smacky Factor, TRM, Sugumo, Yushi, Plasmo, and Yutsukaya. Thanks for watching.